important thing. Put into the hearts of the next generation the love of Allah. Without that, everything else doesn't work. And this is why he says, if the head is cut off, the bird dies. But fear and hope are also important. He describes them as two wings. Two wings. A bird needs both of its wings to be perfect in order to fly. If one wing is damaged, it becomes vulnerable. And he says this is what hope and fear is. If you are able to balance hope in Allah's mercy with fear in Allah's punishment, you will fly to Jannah. Your iman will soar. Your relationship with Allah will be at its best. But if either of these two is deficient, it becomes easy for shaitan to pull you this way or that way. So let's break this down a bit more. Why do we need both? Some people may say that shouldn't hope in Allah's mercy be enough? Why do we need to worry about fear and punishment and all of that? Shouldn't we just talk about hope, talk about love, talk about Jannah? Well, if that was all there is to it, Allah would never mention Jannah. Allah would never mention punishment. The fact that Allah talks about both consistently, and they always go together in the Quran, that itself is proof that both are important. And we have to understand that people have different personality types. Some people are inspired by the pursuit of pleasure. We talk about Jannah, they want to get there. But many people, the only thing that stops them from doing something really bad is the threat of punishment. And you understand, there's different types of people in the world. For some people, it's enough to tell them that if you be good, you will go to Jannah, and they will listen. For many others, it's only knowing that something bad is going to happen to them if they do a sin, that they will stay away from that sin. And the Quran's message encompasses every personality type. Every personality type. Some people need the carrot, some people need the stick. That's just the way human beings are. And the Quran is comprehensive in this way. And most of us are somewhere in the middle. Most of us, there are points in our life where the only thing that will stop us from doing something really, really bad is knowing that Allah will punish us for it. And there are other points in our life that it is the hope of Allah that keeps us going. Right? We all have different points in our life based on how strong our love of Allah is and how strong our iman is at that point in time. So in general, it is hope in Allah's mercy that should govern our relationship with Allah. This should be the norm, this should be the standard, this should be the default. Our default position is one of hope. We hope that Allah answers our du'as. We hope that Allah helps us to fulfill our goals. We hope that Allah forgives us. We hope that Allah accepts our ibadah. Hope is the norm. Hope is the standard. Hope is where we begin from. But that fear must be there as well. Because in our lives, we will face temptation. In our lives, we will face temptation. And sometimes that temptation can be so strong that the only thing that stops you from giving in is knowing that this can lead to something bad in this world or the next. And that's when the fear becomes important. Fearing Allah's punishment. Because Allah's punishment can come in a variety of ways. Right? It is not necessarily just punishment in the afterlife or punishment in the grave. But sometimes it comes in this world. Sometimes you do something wrong in this world and it has negative repercussions in your life. The barakah is removed from your life. The nur is removed from your life. Or there is a series of bad things that happen because of the bad thing that you did. Very often a sin is the beginning of a downward slope towards other sins. So our basic position should be hope, and the fear should be enough to prevent us from sinning. But now this is where we need to understand when we need which one more. Right? So, very simple principle. If you are at a point in your life where there is strong temptation to commit some kind of sin, whether it is an economic sin of selling something haram, whether it's the sin of the flesh or falling into zina, whatever it is, you have a strong temptation to commit some kind of sin. This is when you need fear more than anything else. This is when you need to read the verses about Jahannam. This is when you need to read the verses about Allah's punishment. This is when you need to remind yourself that there's consequences of going down that route. Because that may stop you from falling into it. However, we are human, and it may be even after that we may slip, we may fall sometimes in our lives. There are ways to get back. And this is when we need hope. Right? If you have fallen into sin at any point in your life, this is when you need hope. Because Shaitan's plan is not to make you commit one or two sins. Shaitan's plan is to make you lose hope in Allah's mercy. Right? So if you commit a sin, and then you make sincere tawbah, and that sincere tawbah turns you into a righteous person, Shaitan's fan has backfired completely, right? But if your sin makes you think Allah's never going to forgive me, and because you think Allah's never going to forgive you, you double down on this sin and you do more sins and more sins, you're heading down a downward spiral. Now Shaitan has won. So the point is, if you have fallen into a sin, now it's time for you to focus on the hope. To focus on the hope in Allah's mercy. To remind yourself that at that point, never lose hope in Allah's mercy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the most hopeful verse in the Quran, according to many of the scholars in Surah Az-Zuhr, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ جَمِيعًا إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O my servant, who has sinned against his own self, never lose hope in Allah's mercy. Allah forgives all sins. Allah is most forgiving, most merciful. If you are in a point in your life where you feel like your sins are overwhelming, and you feel like Allah can't forgive you, and you feel like there's no path back to Allah, remind yourself of this verse. Remind yourself Allah forgives all sins. Remind yourself Allah is Ghafurur Rahim. Remind yourself never lose hope in Allah's mercy. This verse is for you in that moment. And this is balance. The temptation's in there, focus on the fear. The temptation's over and you may have fallen, focus on the hope. But the general, focus on the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is what is most important. And there are many verses in the Quran where Allah reminds us that it is this hope in Allah's mercy that is crucial for maintaining our faith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يَقْنَطُ مِن رَحْمَةِ رَبِّهِ إِلَّا الضَّالُونَ. No one loses hope in their Lord's mercy except those who have gone astray. And we have the words of Yaqub alayhi salam, where he said, nobody loses hope in Allah's mercy besides the disbelievers. Meaning a Muslim should always have hope, no matter how far they have fallen, no matter what they have fallen into, there's always a path back to Allah. And so these two concepts together keep us grounded. These two concepts together keep our iman in balance. Fear stops us from doing stupid things. And hope helps us to find a way back to Allah. And if we are able to find this balance in our lives, then inshallah, our spiritual growth will be better, it will be stronger, we will be getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with each passing days, and this will really nourish our souls. When we are able to balance the two wings of hope and fear, and we are able to keep the head of love strong, then inshallah our journey towards Allah will be much smoother. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعد أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير هدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. I showed you a few tips on how to attain balance between hope and fear. The most important one is to recite and reflect on the Quran regularly. One of the beautiful things about the Quran is that this theme of hope and fear flows throughout the entire Quran. Throughout the entire Quran, you will find this theme consistently repeated. Just look at Surah Fatiha. How does Surah Al-Fatiha begin? Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. He is most merciful. Hope. And then, Maliki Yawmiddin. He's the master of the day of judgment. Fear. See the balance? Allah is reminding him, He's most merciful, but you're also accountable to Him on the last day for what you do with your deeds. So right from the beginning, there's this balance. There's hope in one verse, there's the fear in the next verse. And throughout the Quran, you see this. You'll find that some surahs, like Surah Al-Rahman and Surah Al-Waqiyah, they describe Jannah, then they describe Jahannam. There's this balance between the two descriptions. When you look at the end of 29 Juz, for example, you have Surah Al-Dahr, which is all about the beauty of Jannah. And then you have Surah Al-Mursalat, which is all about the horrors of Jahannam. This theme flows throughout the Quran. In one verse in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, know that Allah is most forgiving, most merciful, but also know that His punishment is most severe. And again, you'll find this over and over and over again. So if you are reciting Quran regularly, if you are reflecting on the Quran regularly, you are constantly reminding yourself of both of these things. You are constantly reminding yourself to be hopeful in Allah's mercy, to be hopeful in Allah's forgiveness, to be hopeful in your du'as being answered, to be hopeful in your goals being attained, but also to fear Allah's punishment, to fear the boundaries, to fear disappointing Him, to fear doing things that are displeasing to your beloved. You find this balance if you are reciting Quran regularly. Linked to that is the importance of reflecting on the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, He is the most merciful, this inspires hope. You know Allah is Al-Wadud, He is the most loving, this inspires hope. But you also know He is Al-Jabbar, He's most powerful. He's the one that can force you to do things. He's the one, Malik Yawmiddin. He's the one you're answerable to on the last day. This inspires fear. Learn the names of Allah and reflect on the names of Allah, and you'll find that some of Allah's names inspire hope, some of them inspire fear. You learn them all, you get the balance between the two. The third way to balance is to understand when to do what. The default setting, love and hope. Default setting, love and hope. Your usual relationship with Allah, you love Allah, you're hopeful for His forgiveness, you're hopeful for His mercy, you're hopeful for your du'as being answered. But then you also know when to switch to the fear side. And again, you switch to the fear side when there is temptation. And everyone will face temptation in life, in different forms. When temptation comes, fear Allah. When temptation comes, fear Allah. It's a beautiful saying from the great Sahabi Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Actually, one of the Jummah khutbahs, he mentioned this. He said, خَيْرُ زَادِ تَقْوَى وَرَأْسُ الْحِكْمَةِ وَخَافَةُ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. He said, the best thing you can be given in this world is the fear of Allah. The best thing you can be given in this world is taqwa. Right? Taqwa can be translated as God consciousness or the fear of Allah. And he said, the height of wisdom is to fear Allah. The height of wisdom is to fear Allah. If you fear Allah, you're not going to do foolish things. You're not going to do stupid things. Right? That's why he called it the height of wisdom. It stops you from every type of major sin, from every type of blunder that could ruin your life. And so fearing Allah is a type of wisdom. Knowing when to do it and how to do it. Also understand that if you have fallen into sin, then that's the time when you switch back to hope. Hope and fear both come to play here. Fear of punishment should make you want to get your life back on track, and hope in Allah's mercy should inspire you to seek His forgiveness. Finally, one way to prevent yourself from falling into sin is to study the consequences of each sin. So every major and minor sin has consequences, right? Some of those consequences are in the afterlife. Some of them are spiritual. Many of them are physical. Many of them are physical. So for example, alcohol, there is physical harms that come from alcohol. There is addiction that comes from alcohol. There are physical problems that you can see. But there's also the spiritual side of it. Right? If you look at sins like zina, zina has consequences in the afterlife. It has criminal punishments under Sharia. It has spiritual consequences on your soul. And it has physical consequences in your life. And it has social consequences in the family and society. There are levels of evil that come from the sin. If you study all the harms that come from the sin, you wouldn't want to go near it. Because you understand the ripple effects of negativity it has in your life and in the lives of all those people around you. So when you study the harms of the various sins on both the soul and on the physical world, you're more likely to stay away from these sins. Finally, I end with a reminder. What happens if you only have one and not the other? If you only have hope, and there's no concept of fear whatsoever, what happens to some people? Then shaitan uses it as a trick. Remember, Ibn Qayyim said, you'll be vulnerable to the hunter. The hunter means the shaitan. So shaitan will come in and tell you, Allah is Ghafurur Rahim. You do that sin, Allah will forgive you later. And this becomes a cycle. Every time you want to sin, because there's no fear, shaitan just tells you, do this sin, Allah will forgive you later. And their life just becomes a cycle of sin. We see this with the brothers of Yusuf alayhi salam. What did they say? He said, let's kill him, we can be pious later. These are the words. Let's kill him, we'll be pious later. This is how shaitan tricks you when there's no fear of Allah. The opposite extreme, if there's only fear, if there's no love, if there's no hope, then what happens? Despondency. You commit one sin, you think it's over, life's over, going to hell. Allah's never going to forgive me. And then there's just a downward spiral of sin. So that's why you need balance. Right? If you only fear and there's no hope, then you have no path back if you've fallen. And if you only have hope and no fear, then you have nothing preventing you from doing bad deeds. So you have to have both. And you have to have the love of Allah governing both of these things. And so we must strive in our lives to nurture these qualities. improve our love of Allah, our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, improve our hope in Allah's mercy, improve our fear of His punishment. Understand all of these concepts are equally important for us to become the best versions of ourselves. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us to be the best versions of ourselves. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ وَاجْعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا اللهم اكفنا بحلالك عن حرامك وأغننا بفضلك عمن سواك اللهم انصر المجاهدين في فلسطين اللهم انصر المستضعفين في فلسطين اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.